Hello, can everyone hear me? Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to have you all here. Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Marcine Mitchell. I'm the Senior Vice President for Climate at the WWF, and we welcome you here this afternoon. And I want to welcome you to the America's All In Center, Action Center. And this has become one of my favorite parts of coming to COP. So watching this center spring to life and become a hub for all of our non-federal actors from the U.S. to share all the amazing ways that they are demonstrating that America is all in. I'd first like to start by thanking our panelists and our participants, Vernice Miller-Travis, who's the Executive Vice President of the Metropolitan Group. I'd like to thank Beth Shank, who is the Executive Director of Providence, Mark Andrus, who's the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of California, Nate Holtman, who's the Director of the Center of Global Sustainability of the University of Maryland, Mustafa Ali, who is the Executive Vice President of the National Wildlife Federation. Thank you all for joining us today. Your presence here shows how important it is for all of us to work together to reach our climate goals. So I'd also like to thank the teams, both at WWF and America's All In, for their generosity and time, for making all this happen in the hard work, and to Bloomberg Philanthropy for making this all possible for us. So what does it mean to go all in on climate, and why is that so important for us? Well, the sad news is obvious, is that we're continuing to feel the impacts of climate change. Climate is ravaging communities all over the country. We're feeling the impacts of wildfires, of storms, of floods, of droughts. And it's also harming the most vulnerable communities first and worst all over the world. We know from the UN that we are not on the path to global warming of 1.5 degrees. And in fact, the IPCC tells us that we've now reached 1.1 degrees of warming, and it's still climbing. But every tenth of a degree counts. It all matters. Everything that we can do matters. We know that we need to slow down this runaway train of climate impacts. We need to cut our emissions economy-wide by at least half, 50%, in the next 7 years. So we really need to escalate what we're talking. And when you start to unpack what it means to cut your emissions in half economy-wide, it's quite a heavy lift. But it's not outside of our capabilities. It's something that we can do. But we need to do it at all levels of society. It's not something that one group or even the federal government can go into a corner and figure it all out and just from the top have a magic wand and make it happen. It's something that we have to do all together, every part of society. It's a big lift. We need businesses of every size across every sector of the industry to do their part. We need local and state governments to act comprehensively across their constituencies. We need healthcare, cultural and academic and religious institutions to bring their resources and their communities and their voices to bear. We'll need to include every community, indigenous peoples, tribal nations, frontline and fence-line neighborhoods, so that people who are already overburdened get some relief and receive the full measure of the benefits. And I want to emphasize that. It's not only about climate justice in the sense of not having the impacts, but it's also about justice of being able to reap the benefits that will come as we change our society. So I want to emphasize that for everything. So America needs to go all in because it's going to take every one of us to reach our climate goals. And the power of this coalition of nearly 5,000 non-federal actors lies in our diversity. We come from all parts of the country, all kinds of businesses, large and small, all kinds of institutions from everywhere on the map. People who tell us that climate is a decisive issue should come and look at our community. because we are really showing how people from all walks of life can come together. And that diversity really makes a difference. Once you step away from Capitol Hill, and I'm based in Washington, D.C., so it kind of feels like inside the Beltway is all what the world is. But that's not true. Once you step outside of that world, into the country, into our country, we know that you realize that Americans want climate solutions. That's the reality of our country. It's why a community college in the heart of Nebraska has become one of the champions of solar energy and green buildings on its campus. It's why the National Aquarium in Baltimore has been revamping its massive temperature control needs, if you can imagine, as an aquarium, to rely less on fossil fuels. It's why the city of Fort Collins, Colorado, is moving towards electrifying their public buildings and public transit fleet, committing to reduce their emissions by 80% by 2030. So we encourage you over the next few days to join us at this pavilion and hear more of these wonderful stories, these heartfelt stories, these things that will give you optimism and hope and make you keep going. Because sometimes we go into that tunnel of despair. Working together, we can see that there are a lot of solutions and that people are already working to do many things. And it's not just about the United States. America is all in as part of a larger network of non-federated federal actors around the world called the Alliance of Climate Action. And the ACA is establishing similar networks of state and local governments, businesses, and institutions in countries like Japan, Brazil, South Africa, Chile, and many, many more. And because we know that when people demonstrate that they are all in on climate solutions, their governments will also follow them. So just to end, we're at a pivotal point in our fight against climate change. We need to act now, all of us at every level. We all need to dedicate ourselves to be all in, because climate change is not going to let up, so neither can we. So thank you very much. So I'd like to now introduce Dr. Mustafa Sandiego Ali, who is the Executive Vice President of Environmental Justice and Climate and Community Revitalization of the National Wildlife Federation. Before joining NWF, Dr. Mustafa was a Senior Vice President for the Hip Hop Caucus, a national nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that connects the hip hop community to the civic process. And we have met your Reverend, who has been a big part of that and is just a great spokesman for that organization. Dr. Mustafa Ali worked 22 years at the EPA and 2 years on Capitol Hill. He has testified on Capitol Hill numerous times, highlighting how strong legislation can drive more inclusive policies, investments, and actions that have a direct effect on our most vulnerable communities. So welcome, Dr. Ali.
That's cool. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, let's try it again so folks can hear us. Good afternoon, everyone. That's right. You got to embrace your power. You got to let folks know that you're serious about these issues, that you're committed, and that we know that change can happen. Let me ask you all a question. How many folks in the room love your mother, your grandmother? Raise your right hand. Everybody look around. See who does not love their mom. Just go over there real quick and give them a hug. You know, my mom and my grandmother gave me some great lessons as I was growing up. And one of the things that my grandmother instilled in me is that you have power unless you give it away. The other thing that she shared with me that continues to stick with me each and every day is that we have to create a circle. My grandmother, when I was little, she used to go and get people off the street and she would cook for them. She would make sure that they had the things that they needed to be able to know that their lives had meaning, that they were seen, that they were heard, and that they were understood. And I take those lessons forward in the work that we do now. When I think about this moment that we find ourselves in, this transformational moment, that we have the opportunity to really do some amazing things. We often have been thinking about these issues for far too many people in a survival mentality. I believe that we can move our most vulnerable communities and our societies from surviving to thriving. Then we have to ask ourselves the question, Well, how do we actually do that? What are the steps that are necessary? We have to begin with the process of understanding first and foremost that climate justice is economic justice. Does that make sense to everyone? And that economic justice, yes, you can clap for that, and that economic justice is environmental justice. Environmental justice is racial justice. When we understand all of these different components and how they come together, it begins to help us to have a better understanding that if we are going to succeed in the steps that are going to be necessary to address the climate crisis, but to move beyond the crisis into creating a thriving society, that we have to understand that our most vulnerable communities have often been unseen, they've been unheard, and under-resourced. So as we are creating our plans that are so incredibly important, our NDCs, if you will, if we begin to start with making sure that our most vulnerable are going to be able to benefit from the actions and the resources, then we're moving in the right direction. I promised that I would be brief, so let me just bring into our conversation, as we are thinking about those NDCs, that we now have a green print, not a blueprint. Y'all say that with me, green print, not a blueprint. So now that everybody's catching up, we'll try it again, because some people are a little tight. They come to these things and they're like, well, I have to be proper. No, we have to be activated. We have to have an action oriented, and we have to make these issues actually resonate with everyday people. Everybody doesn't work in the government. Everybody isn't a top executive. Everybody hasn't been blessed to have certain information that many of us have. So we have to make sure that folks understand and feel our enthusiasm on the issues that we're working on, because we get to actually help to make change happen. So we'll say it one more time. Green print, not a blueprint. So in the United States, we've been blessed with President Biden that we've got some sets of actions that are in place. The panel will take you much, much deeper, but just let me reference a few things as we move forward. So one of them is the Inflation Reduction Act. The many of us have been doing the work for years, but we didn't have the resources. We had great ideas. In many instances, there was vision that was there, but you have to match those visions, those ideas, those sets of actions with the resources to make it come alive. So the Inflation Reduction Act gives us an opportunity to begin to do all of those things. We've been able to build out the grid. We're able to create, electrification for vehicles, and not just cars, but also buses and a number of other things that are going to be necessary. We also have the opportunity, something that I'm a big proponent of finally being able to make sure that everyone who wants to be an entrepreneur in this space now has an opportunity to do it. Many folks who are here today are taking advantage of that opportunity. We're going to have to grow that exponentially out. And there are a number of other things, but I want to bring also into our conversation before I close, both the bipartisan infrastructure bill, right? Which is a part of that green pen, and making sure that we are rebuilding crumbling infrastructures, and sometimes in many communities, non-existent infrastructures. And we also know that that is going to give us an opportunity to play a role in lowering the emissions that are going on as we transform our climate economy into something that is real for everyday people. And then I'll bring into our conversation also the CHIPS Act, because we understand to make some of these other things happen, we've got to make sure that the right types of things are going. All of those things are fantastic, but without our Justice 40 initiative in the United States, where we make sure that 40% of the benefits are actually going to our most vulnerable communities, who once again have often been not the recipients of the dollars that were necessary, the sets of actions that were necessary. When you make sure that you're infusing that into, and I'm speaking to the international community now, when you make sure that you're integrating that into those NDCs, then you have something that's alive. You have something that folks can actually feel and know that they are being seen and represented in that space. So as I close, I want to bring Dr. King into our conversation. Dr. Martin Luther King once said that we come to these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. We are in this larger, international, global ship, and that ship has to be driven by the winds of justice. When we do that, we have something that's real. When we do that, we make sure that we have real power. I'm Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. I want to thank each and every one of you for the amazing work that you're doing and the work that you will continue to expand and bring others into. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali, very, very much. So now I'd like to ask Nate Holtman to come up and say a few words to us.
Sure. Well, thanks, Marcine, and thank you, Dr. Mustafa Ali, for those, where did he go, for those inspiring comments. There he is. We have a couple of slides here. So my name is Nate Holtman. I'm the director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland. There we go. Can you hear me now? All right, let's try that again. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Nate Holtman. I'm the director of the University of Maryland Center for Global Sustainability, and it's been thank you very much. All right. And it has been my great pleasure to be working with the All-In team, the coalition, all the coalition partners, all the great organizations that you guys represent, doing all that work that Dr. Ali was talking about out in all the parts of the United States of America, bringing that action to different kinds of communities, different kinds of places, different kinds of actor groups, and exerting your leadership to help us solve the problems that we're all here today to tackle. It's also been my pleasure to work with a couple of other awesome organizations, the World Resources Institute and the RMI, on the All-In analytical team. And some of the work we're presenting today is reflective of the kinds of work that we do. Now, all the kinds of work that you do is great, and one of the things that is always a big question is, what does it all add up to? Like, all these different groups, they're all doing things. You got your faith groups, you got your universities, you got your cities, you got your states, you got everybody kind of working together. Healthcare organizations, I don't know if you guys are here, but we've got a bunch of different ones, and I'm sorry if I didn't mention yours. There's a whole long list. But anyway, everybody's doing their part. Everybody's kind of taking your organization, doing something new, trying to, whether it's driving down your emissions or being more resilient or doing other kinds of work in your community to make you more climate friendly in some way. Question is, what does it all add up to? So what we've been trying to do is understand the answer to that. That's helpful for us all, to see the kinds of impact that you all are having. And it's great for you guys, you're doing work, to see that it adds up to helping the United States get on and achieve a more ambitious pathway. That also allows our federal government to do more. And it did allow this administration, when it came in, to put on the table a much higher ambition climate target in the context of this UN Framework Convention process than it could have put down otherwise if you had not been doing that work over the past number of years. So it's quite important, the work that you're doing. It builds a higher basis for action at the national, and that builds a higher basis for action at the international level. So all that work matters, and what the story we try to tell is how all of your work aggregates together. What does it do for the United States? So that's what I'm going to tell you about today, and I'm going to keep it quick. Let's see here. So a couple of takeaways from this is that there's been a lot of things happening in the last year and a half. Okay, a new target put on the table, 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. Again, that was predicated, I am confident, our analysis shows that level of ambition was made possible by you, by the work that's been happening. Okay, now we need federal partnership, and I'm also acknowledging all the awesome work that's happened out of this federal administration. Good for them. They've done a tremendous job, and I want to also applaud their work and leadership in getting the United States and our leadership in this COP process back to where it ought to be. Now, key takeaways from the report: we can do it with your continued help, with our continued work together. Number two, we are seeing historic federal policy achievements. We heard earlier the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Those are transformational federal policies that will build a long-term and very policy sticky basis for us to continue to deliver in the United States, getting toward our goal. There's still a gap to get to our 50%. We never expected that in 2022 we'd be done. That was not the plan. The plan is let's do as much as we can, doing as much policy work as we can do every year. We've been doing that last year and this year, but there's a bunch more years in the decade. We still got to keep doing it. So that part of what we need to do next. And then finally, cities, states, businesses, the other organizations in All In are a critical part of how we're going to do that work. So this is just a little bit of technical stuff, but I just want to show you where we are today is shown by that solid line there and going up to the kind of 2020 level that you see. Right now, with Inflation Reduction Act and the other recent legislation, our analysis shows that that would drive us to something like a 39% decrease by 2030. Now, there's a range, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds today about like the ranging, but there's a range because IRA still needs to be implemented, and there's, hopefully we can do at the upper end of that. The other thing we showed, though, is with additional action from all of you, from all of us in the United States, we can get to 52. We think we can get over 50, maybe even to 52. You never know. Maybe we could even do better, but right now that's what our analysis is showing. Let's always aim higher so we can see where we can get. This is a little bit more of a breakdown, and again, I don't want to take too much time. I really would invite you. You've got these little cards on your seats. You can download the report, take a look at it. If you're kind of a mind to try to learn more about it, we're always happy to interact and talk to you more about it. I love working with people on that. So what you can see here is that the work happens not just in like energy and renewables. It happens across all sectors and all greenhouse gases. And so it's really important. Everything you can do in every sector, you see, there are a couple of big chunks, but there's a lot of chunks, and every chunk matters, right? You can't get to the 50 to 52 without action across the entire spectrum. So all of the work, whether you're working on methane reductions, whether you're working on deploying clean energy, whether you're working on agricultural topics or agricultural issues, all of that does add up. And so take some energy from this. It's working, it's helping, it's making a difference, and it will continue to be important over time. Now, I do want to show, this is more like a research talk, so I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but I just want to give you a little bit of a teaser. If you are interested in a specific sector, we do have some specific indications of what those policies are doing, and in the report there are a lot more details of what kinds of things could be done in different policy contexts. This is just showing you how the Beyond 50 scenario gets us to essentially close to zero coal by 2030 and deploys a lot of new renewables and other kinds of clean technologies. Transportation, what we see is Beyond 50, we're approaching roughly 50% of new clean electric vehicle sales by 2030, and about 40% freight trucks. And one thing interesting, a lot of what people here in this group are working on, clean buses for municipal transportation. That includes school bus fleets and municipal fleets. That's critically important. We need that kind of work, and please keep working on that. Methane is another one. Methane's been a very strongly growing topic of interest. Methane is critical. We have underutilized, we have underappreciated the importance of methane reductions in achieving U.S. and particularly global goals. Methane is fast emissions reduction. It helps us avoid peak warming. It really is going to be critical for the 2030s and 2040s to reduce methane emissions. So we've done a lot of work on methane in this country. One of our other analyses shows that in the U.S., if with an all-in effort, we can achieve a 30% reduction in methane emissions by 2030. I want the U.S. hopefully will step up and do something like that formally. They've already signed the Methane Pledge, which is a 30% collective by 2030. And I think that with your work, we might be able to get there in the United States as well. Finally, on buildings, it's another area quite important. A lot of work happens in cities, in municipalities, in states about building codes. It's critically important. All electric hookups by 2030 is one, for example, that we need to be looking at very carefully. And with that, I'm actually going to wrap up, and I'm very happy to say thank you for paying attention. I want to also acknowledge, before you clap, my 17 co-authors of this report who did awesome work, and they really put a lot of energy and effort across all three of our organizations, and we really appreciate their work. We really appreciate Bloomberg Philanthropies for supporting the work, and of course, the partnership with the America's All In Coalition and organizations. And thank you for all that you're doing. We really appreciate it. So thanks for that. And I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Dan Lashoff from WRI, who's the director of the U.S. Climate Program there. So Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Nate. So again, awesome work. WRI has been very pleased to be part of the research team supporting the All In Coalition, contributing to this report and a couple of previous reports that I'm going to touch on looking at the benefits of the clean energy transition. I'm going to talk about just two sectors to keep it short, talk about buildings and transportation. So again, I'm Dan Lashoff, U.S. Director at World Resources Institute, and a number of people in our organization have contributed to this work that I'm building on. So let's talk about buildings. We know that moving to zero emission buildings is essential to meet the kind of targets that Nate just talked about and to be consistent with the Paris Climate Agreement. The good news is that moving to zero emission buildings is healthier, is cheaper, and is more comfortable and convenient for the people who live in those buildings. So let's talk about each of those really quickly. People have been burning gas in their houses, and the gas industry has promoted that, cooking with gas, if you remember those old commercials. But it turns out that cooking with gas is actually really bad for you. It's an open flame in your kitchen producing nitrogen oxides and a whole bunch of other pollutants, and the effects of that are increasingly documented. Switching from a gas stove to an induction stove not only allows you to get zero emission from your cooking if your electricity is from clean sources, as it's getting cleaner and cleaner, but I have it. It boils water faster. You can control the temperature. You don't have an open flame in your kitchen, which means it's safer for your kids. It's an awesome transition. Similar story with heat pump water heaters, with heat pump air conditioning and heating. Getting rid of those gas flames in our buildings is a win for your health. And it's cheaper over time, particularly for new buildings. You don't have to go to the expense of hooking up a new gas line, extending that line. Right now, we actually subsidize buildings to hook up to gas because that's socialized across all of the gas consumers. So California is the first state to get rid of that. We're hoping every other state does the same thing. That's going to make it cheaper for everybody. And a building that is designed to be efficient, where you don't have cold air leaking in the winter or hot air leaking in the summer, but it's well insulated, efficient buildings, it's going to be more comfortable for you. So again, zero emission buildings are healthier, they're cheaper, they're more convenient, and more comfortable. We have to make sure that they're available to everyone in all communities. So in a lot of cases that means creative financing. It means making sure we're investing in low-income housing and not just in expensive housing, that we're building enough housing, that we build that housing zero emission from the beginning. Okay, I'm going to keep it short, move on to the transportation sector. Our biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, guess what? It turns out that moving to a zero emission transportation system is healthier, it's cheaper, and it's more convenient and comfortable for consumers. So let's talk about that. When we think about zero emission transportation, we often think about electric cars. I'm going to come to that, but let's start with the actual transportation system. If we center people rather than cars in the way we build our transportation system in our neighborhoods, that is a way to make it healthier for people. If you have an option to ride a bike, to walk, because your neighborhoods are safe, there's sidewalks, there's protected bike lanes, that's a healthier way to get where you're going. So it's healthier from that point of view before we even get to the air pollution impacts of the vehicles. And it's often more convenient and cheaper. So let's talk about the vehicles. Electric vehicles have been thought of as something for rich people and out of reach for the average consumers. But the price of electric vehicles has come down to the point where some of the new models are less expensive than the average new vehicle that's sold in the United States. And with the incentives of up to $7,500 in the Inflation Reduction Act, electric vehicles are going to be the cheapest vehicle to drive off the lot from day one for most people. Now, it turns out that only wealthier people buy new vehicles. Lower income people tend to rely on the used car market. It's going to take a while to build a used car market because you have to sell the new cars first. But the Inflation Reduction Act also, for the first time, has tax incentives for used electric vehicles, a way to help people get charging infrastructure in their homes for used electric vehicles. So that's a big benefit in terms of reducing cost. And it's simply a better driving experience. If you've ever been in an electric vehicle, it's just better in every way. It's so much more convenient to charge up at home by plugging in and have a full tank of electricity when you drive out in the morning rather than visiting a gas station. Now, again, we have to make sure that electric is for all. So we have to make sure that charging infrastructure is available for people who don't have access to off-street charging. We're starting to do that with investments from the Inflation Reduction Act and to build a nationwide charging infrastructure. Well, we have to make sure we're building chargers not just in the interstate highway system, but in neighborhoods where people need it. And that can look like retrofitting lampposts with low voltage chargers so that you can plug in near your home if you don't have a garage. I'm going to end with my favorite topic in clean transportation. Nate mentioned it, and that's electric school buses. Right now, we have a fleet of almost entirely diesel school buses, about 480,000 of them. They transport about 25 million kids in the United States a year, and those kids are exposed to known carcinogens with pollution levels that can be 4 to 10 times higher inside the bus than outside the bus. It's a crazy thing to do. And fortunately, more and more states and school districts are recognizing that it's a crazy thing to do. And with investments from the, in this case, bipartisan infrastructure law, EPA just announced its first round of grants, rebates for electric school buses. Demand was 8 times higher than what they initially allocated in funding, so they actually doubled how much money they give out. Almost $1 billion. There will be an electric school bus in every state in the United States over the next couple of years as a result of the grants that were announced just recently. Our vision is to completely transition the fleet from diesel polluting school buses to electric school buses by 2030. We think we can do that both by switching to all new buses should be electric, and ultimately there's an option to retrofit the newer chassis so you don't have to throw them away, so we can complete the transition. And guess what? Those school buses are mobile batteries, which means that they can actually benefit the grid and they can supply electricity in an emergency, such as after a hurricane or wildfire knocks out the grid. So it's a huge benefit for everyone. There's a school in every neighborhood in the United States. This is a way to make sure that the benefits of the clean energy transition reach everyone. With that, thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. So now I'd like to ask our panelists to come up, and we're just going to have a few questions about really what does America's all in mean. Sit anywhere? Yeah. Sit down. Yeah. But, good. Well, is she gonna? No, she's going on the way down. So let's move you down by one. Okay. Great. Thank you all for joining us, and look forward to talking a little bit about, diving into a little bit of detail of, from our coalition about what America is all in means to each of you. So why don't we start with that question? I mean, it's a great title, right? America is all in. But beyond the title, what does it mean really to go all in for climate? I mean, at the local level, at the level of your organizations, what does that mean to you? So why don't we start here?
Hello. I'm Mark Andrus, introduced earlier. Marcina, thank you so much for hosting this, and it's already been inspiring, hasn't it? All the presentations, thank you. Really wonderful. I'm going to not tell you all the concrete things that churches and mosques and synagogues and temples are doing. It is stunning, but I'm going to talk exactly to this question of what does all in mean. And there's two stories that illustrate what it means to me. The first one took place on Election Day 2016 at the COP in Marrakesh. So we were, many hours, sort of the same hours difference from the United States as we are here in Egypt. And those of us at the COP were tracking all night long and getting more and more depressed and upset about the fact that we were electing a climate denier to be the President of the United States. 30,000 climate activists were gathered in Marrakesh, and we woke up to a climate denier president-elect. I was in a small room with people from the U.S. CAN, Climate Action Network, the next morning, and the question was, what shall we do? And the literal thing happened that you read about. A scientist, a climate scientist in the room, had worked it out on the back of an envelope and literally said, we can do this without the federal government until the federal government comes back in. And we said, well, should we call that? And they said, we're still in, but you can't tweet that with an apostrophe, so it's we're still in. So that didn't work very well. Past tense. But that was a hopeful moment of the beginning of an all society, a whole society approach to this. Prior to that, we were to some extent passive. The people were relying on the federal government to do the work. And when we realized we could not, you stepped up. The coalition that's America's All In now stepped up, and more people that didn't join us in that, but they were doing their work. And that phrase, a whole society approach, became ubiquitous. And that's what we're living with now. But, I'm a man of faith. I'm a human of faith. And I want to take one other story. So that was 2016. This was 2006. Rural Alabama. And John Lewis, Representative John Lewis, was my guest at a racial reconciliation pilgrimage. And he introduced me there to the term beloved community. And you remember when he died, his message went out to the world that day that he had devoted his life from the time he was a freedom rider to maintaining what his friend Martin Luther King Jr. taught him was the beloved community. And he said that to this group of young people and clergy like me in Alabama. And afterwards I said, Representative Congressman Lewis, what does it mean? What does beloved community mean? And this is what he told me. The beloved community is a community of all of life. No one is outside the circle of the beloved community. And that includes life that's not human life. All of life. The life of the planet, the life of every human community, all is in the beloved community. And they are bound together not by common interest in dominating or becoming richer or more powerful. They are bound together by what Dr. King called agape love. Agape love has three kind of general translations. The first you hear is unconditional love. It's not based on transaction. What can you give me? It's also called sacrificial love, meaning I'm going to give completely. But the third one is the one I love, and it's called overflowing love, meaning that the source of love has no end, is inexhaustible. So two outcomes that are consequential from living loyally in the beloved community, as Representative Lewis did, as Dr. King did, as Thich Nhat Hanh did, as Howard Thurman did, as A.J. Muste did, as maybe you do. Two consequences are, when we talk about just transition, we're going to want to do that. It's not an afterthought. We're not going to move our technology along and leave coal miners behind or any other part of the industry. We're going to say, it's incumbent on us, because we live in the same beloved community, to pursue just transition. And the second thing is this: every voice will make us more creative. Every voice will make us more capacious. Every voice will solve the problems that we don't know how to solve. I was introduced at this COP to a term that I had not heard, and it is this: post-traumatic growth. Not post-traumatic stress, which is real, but post-traumatic growth, which means that people who are experiencing the degradation of their environment and the leading effects of climate change, these are mostly the most vulnerable people. We know this. And they are the very people who are, through their suffering and travail, better able, because of many of them are entering into post-traumatic growth, to solve their own problems. 2010 in Haiti, that devastating earthquake, and we rushed in. How many hundreds of NGOs rushed in? We knew better. We knew better, we thought, than the Haitians about how to solve their own problems. We were wrong. The beloved community recognizes that those voices in Haiti, those voices in Kivalina, those voices in Ile Saint-Jean-Charles in Louisiana, everywhere else where loss and damage is taking place, they know better than we do how to solve their own problems. That's another consequence of the beloved community. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. It's very inspirational. A lot for us to think about. We're going to turn now to Bernice.
Thank
Are
you.
you on?
So the beloved community has been locked out of this conversation for a long time. A lot of the components of the beloved community. They haven't been silent. They haven't been invisible. They just haven't been centered in this conversation, right? But they've been having their own conversations. So a part of this concept and construct of all in means that the doors have to open, the table has to get bigger, the room has to get bigger, the layers of the conversation have to get bigger, the folks that we invite, the folks that we center, the folks that we lift up, the folks that we listen to have to be diverse and different than the voices that we're used to hearing. So one of those voices was, I moderated a panel with that person and several other leaders of the conversation around environmental and climate justice this morning, and that is the Chief Environmental Minister of the United States, Michael Regan, the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agencies. He's 46 years old. He was 44 years old when the U.S. Senate confirmed him to be the EPA Administrator. And why do I raise that up? I raise that up because Administrator Regan comes into this conversation with none of the baggage that those of us who, like me, have been working in this space for 38 years. He has none of that baggage. He has a vision around how do we solve these issues? How do we make the table bigger? How do we bring other people into the conversation? How do we take the resources of our federal government, which are enormous, and put them into the places that have long been bypassed and long been overlooked? And that is what he is doing. And so I asked him a question earlier today. Why are you linking up and creating a new structure within the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that marries environmental justice and civil rights protection? And he said, because racial justice and racial equity in the United States of America, and dare I say it, worldwide, is central to solving the climate crisis. And one of the reasons we haven't been able to get our arms around this is because we've left many someones out. And so now the circle is bigger. The table is bigger. Those that we invite in to advise us around policy is more diverse. Different voices, different perspectives. The very communities you talked about, they're over at the Climate Justice Pavilion, P119. Come and hear them speak for themselves. Come and hear them give their own vision for how we work our way out of this. But we cannot do it by ourselves. We cannot. We've tried that. We've tried all being in our own lanes, in our own organizations, in our own sets of the environmental space and civil society. And we've not been able to really undertake the most massive rethinking, restructuring, recentering, refinancing that is required. So here's something that people are talking about, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a great new piece of federal legislation. Within the Inflation Reduction Act is a new instrument called the Green Bank. The first time in the history of the United States that we have gotten into the conversation about the Green Bank. $89 million to kick it off, right? It's not the totality, it's not all that we need, but it's a major commitment by the Environmental Protection Agency to say we need different kinds of financing mechanisms at home. And if we can have different kinds of financing mechanisms at home, we can talk about different kinds of global financing mechanisms. Loss and damage, we struggle with that every day in the United States of America. 2/3 of the state of Florida are dealing with that right now. And right here as we sit right now, there's another Hurricane Nicole rolling right across Florida and coming up the eastern seaboard. Did you know that there were people of color that lived in that part of Florida that was hit by the last hurricane? Did you know that? Did you know that the Seminole Nation in Seminole County, Florida was destroyed by that last hurricane? Did you know that? You didn't know that because none of them were ever on television. We didn't talk to them, we didn't feature them, we didn't lift them up. And so when we talk about all in has to be a different vision, a different structure, a different way of thinking about who can help us solve this climate crisis. And it's not just the people who've been around the table so far, right? So one of the things I love about this COP is that it's the African COP. And we can have a whole nother conversation about North Africa versus the rest of Africa. We're not going to have that conversation today, right? But it is the African COP. And you see the African nations here in a way that you have never seen them before. You see them aligned. You see them thinking atmospherically. You see them thinking hemispherically about what do we need to do? What are the structures that we need to do? You see a new conversation around extractive industries. And what is happening on the continent, what is happening in other places. So we talk about green buses, we talk about green cars, we talk about electric vehicles. What's required to make that mechanism work? Resources that are not in the countries that want to build out that infrastructure. The Congo is one of the places where we see the largest supply of those resources that can fuel electric vehicles. So as we think about expanding, we have to think about justice and equity and fairness, and that all-in concept has got to be a different concept than the way we've talked about it heretofore. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you. And my name is Beth Schenk. I'm Executive Director of Environmental Stewardship for Providence. I'm going to talk about something pretty different but related. I'm talking about healthcare. Healthcare in the United States creates 8.5% of our greenhouse gas emissions. It's almost 18% of our GDP. It's in crisis right now, post-pandemic, and in our inflationary period. Nonetheless, Providence, which is a large health system on the West Coast, 52 hospitals, 1,000 clinics, university, high school, in 7 western states, Alaska, Washington, Montana, Oregon, California, New Mexico, and Texas. Nonetheless, we are all in. We're all in on the leadership panel, and we're all in with our own commitment, because we have committed to do everything we can in this pivotal decade, by 2030. And our statement is carbon negative by 2030. So we are working in so many directions, and I want to tell you just a little bit about that in a few minutes. 2 main directions, mitigation and adaptation, familiar terms to all of us. Our mitigation framework is synopsized by We Act, which is a different We Act than we have here. It stands for things: waste, energy, water, agriculture, food, chemicals, and transportation. We're working on all of those categories in meaningful ways, and I could talk with you about each of them for an hour, but I won't. And then for our adaptation side, partly because of our response to the HHS pledge, which you may have heard about here, Health and Human Services asked health systems to sign on to a pledge to reach 50% reduction by 2030, 100% reduction by 2050, to have an executive leader, and also to have a resiliency plan. So our resiliency plan we're working on in 2023, and I'm going to give you another acronym. It is We Reach: resilience, equity, adaptation, climate, health. To do that, we're reaching into communities that we serve from Alaska to Texas, and we've spent the last year and a half examining the environmental determinants of health in these communities and who this is impacting and who is working on it. Because our strategy is not to recreate the wheel, but to work with existing partners to help spread the wealth of knowledge and of health education and of financial support when we can. So this is an important piece of our adaptation work. But there's the other side, which goes back to your comments about buildings. So our buildings, we have nearly 40 million square feet that we own and manage. Our buildings are hurting as well right now. An example, during the heat dome of last summer, 2021, Portland, Oregon hit 116 degrees Fahrenheit. Seattle hit 108 degrees. One of our major hospitals in Portland, south-facing wall, they told us that the door jambs and building frames worked. Further, that mass of concrete and steel held onto the heat for so long that the HVAC system was wonky and hard to manage for another 10 days. These buildings weren't built for that kind of heat, but we're in that kind of heat right now today. So that's major work for us to do to prepare and to repair, really. So I know time is very short, and so I'm going to just give you a quote, and it's actually from the Pope. He's Episcopalian. But Pope Francis, and first of all, I'm not Catholic, but our health system is Catholic. I think Pope Francis has been a transformational figure for the 1.5 or so billion Catholics around the world and billions of non-Catholics. My favorite quote is this, and I think it wraps up a little bit of what we're all saying. We don't have a social crisis and an environmental crisis. Instead, we have a complex socio-environmental crisis which must be addressed using the same mechanisms: addressing poverty, respect for the individual and equity, and care for our common home, the planet. That drives our work, anchors us in reality today and in the future to come, so that we are all in with all of you, with public infrastructure, and with all people that we can reach. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. I wish we had more time. There's so much more to talk about, but I want to thank our panel very much. And I hope everyone had a chance to learn a little something. I mean, what I really took away was how we have to think about things differently as we approach this climate crisis. It's not just a crisis of climate, as you put in. It's a social crisis. It's a health crisis. It's an economic crisis, right? And it's a crisis of faith, of how we treat each other, who gets included, who gets benefits. And so it's a really interesting time for us, but it's also a time for opportunity, right? It's a time for us to look at things differently, to open our society in a way that we maybe haven't had to before. So sometimes challenge is the invention of many, many new things. And growth, as you say. Coming out of trauma, there's growth. So I hope you would all join me in just thanking our panelists and thanking our speakers very much. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. You do such a great job.
If folks want to, we'll take a picture. If folks want to stay seated, Senator Ed Markey and Ali Zaidi are about to take the stage, and we're going to do some quick remarks.